This weekend, somewhere in the world, an opera by Giacomo Puccini is playing to a packed house.
Here we are, and he's still the most popular, most bankable composer in our opera houses. And that's pretty extraordinary because for a guy who wrote 12 operas, almost all of them are in the standard repertory. There's not really any other composer that you can say that about.
Why are Puccini's operas still in demand? For the simple reason that they touch the human heart.
That was Puccini's great gift. There's a tremendous emotional effectiveness that's impossible to resist.
Giacomo Puccini opened the door to opera with his engaging music set to stories about real people.
Puccini is the people's opera composer. Anyone that you're trying to turn on to opera, you send them to a Puccini opera.
His musical vision revolutionized opera, and his heartfelt melodies continue to move us. Giacomo Puccini transformed opera from a remote world of fantasy, common to most operas of his time, into a modern art form that explored everyday experiences. His most famous opera, La Bohème, premiered in 1896 and remains one of the most beloved operas ever written.
It's funny, it's touching, it's clear and emotionally engaging. It just works on every level. It's Puccini's best opera as far as I'm concerned, and the one that really doesn't have any false steps from beginning to end.
La Bohème, The Bohemians, is set in an artist's loft in the city of Paris.
It was so different than anyone expected. It was a bunch of students on stage, people who are on the fringes. We've never had that before.
Rodolfo, a poet, lives with his three roommates, a writer, a painter, and a philosopher.
I don't think there's anybody who can't identify on some level with poor, young, starving artists who have to cope with all kinds of difficulties, but who manage to also have fun.
These characters were inspired by Puccini's own experiences in 1881 as a student at the Music Conservatory in Milan.
He had gone through very similar things in his student days in Milan. There's a letter to his mother where he talks about the way he makes his budget stretch is that every day what he has for dinner is 3 bowls of minestrone because it's cheap and filling.
Puccini spent time with friends in the local cafes and attending the opera. At that time, before radio and television, opera was the most popular entertainment in Italy, and thousands of people flocked to new productions every week. Composer Giuseppe Verdi was then Italy's greatest opera composer. Over the course of his life, Verdi would compose 21 major operas, all based on momentous subjects, such as important political events in history or on the plays of William Shakespeare. While Puccini was inspired by Verdi's music, he wanted nothing to do with such weighty plots.
He wasn't interested in huge moral, social, philosophical issues. He said he was interested in writing about cosettine, small souls with great sorrows.
Puccini searched for dramas that dealt with basic feelings like love, hatred, betrayal, and even illness. He matched these deeply emotional stories with his equally moving melodies.
He really was interested in the common person, and that's who he was interested in writing about and writing for.
Most importantly, he wanted the hero of his opera to be a woman.
Every one of his operas is dominated by a female figure, but there's a definite pattern among those heroines. Almost always we find a woman who seems vulnerable, but because of great love that they have, Somehow, this seemingly weak woman rises to very courageous heights.
For La Bohème, Puccini found his heroine in the character of Mimi, a poor seamstress suffering from tuberculosis. It is Mimi's entrance into Rodolfo's life and her heartbreaking exit from it that is the backbone of La Bohème.
In most Puccini operas, you hear the heroine before you ever see her. He's saying to us, I want your first impression of this woman to be through the ears. You know, it's an opera, it's music.
Her voice somehow is something that has struck him, you know. So I think even before she enters the room, he's fallen in love simply with her voice.
Captivated by Mimi, Rodolfo does what most men would do. He talks about himself.
He says, and I'll tell you who I am. Who am I? And then he sings the tenor's favorite note. So he sings this B flat, and it's sort of like, ta-da. It's really a visceral thrill. It really sort of makes your skin tingle and go excited. So she suddenly, oh, well, this isn't so bad. You know, let me take another look here. She's like a daisy with a backbone of steel. She's going to wilt and fade, but not willingly. Mimi's very courageous.
Puccini's heroines are such incredibly vivid characters and drawn in such detail in a way that very, very few opera composers ever have been able to draw any characters, male or female.
Like Giuseppe Verdi, Germany's Richard Wagner was a big influence in Puccini's young life. Before him, the Italians had dominated opera for more than 200 years. But Wagner turned the world of opera upside down and began to use musical themes to identify characters, objects, and ideas.
Wagner is less interested in the characters usually as individuals. Many of his characters tend to be symbols.
Puccini was strongly influenced by Richard Wagner's use of motives. By a motive, I mean a theme, a tune, a melody that introduces a thought.
Wagner's opera Siegfried uses many motifs to represent knights, dragons, and even a sword.
We hear in Siegfried, which is the motive of the sword. It's like a calling card in a certain extent. Here's a sword, and this is what it sounds like. And the sword motif then can be recalled in the orchestra, and we know what it's talking about.
Instead of using musical motifs to evoke mythical swords, Puccini wrote tunes that captured the personalities and feelings of his characters. Mimi's signature melody is first heard in Act 1.
And she sings, "My name is Mimi." Whenever she reappears on stage, we hear her tune. Does that mean that he's reminding us who she is? No. We know who she is. We don't need to be told that she's Mimi by Act 4. But it's the aura that she brings, it's the perfume of the character, if you will, which is wafted up from the orchestra pit.
Puccini did one thing and did it really well. Make your heart bleed for the soprano.
Act 2 of La Bohème is set in an outdoor cafe. Instead of background music, Here, Puccini has written a score that drives the action, and on top of that, it's crafted to sound like spoken conversation. This musical dialogue is what makes Act Two unique in all of opera history. Nobody had done anything quite like it before, and nobody would ever do it so successfully again. Puccini's music was indeed modern. But when La Bohème opened on February 1st, 1896, it was too modern for the critics.
It was not the kind of success that one might have expected. All the initial reviews said that Act Two was the least successful of the acts, and that it ended inconclusively.
But time and again, Puccini took bad reviews and audience feedback and turned them into musical gems. His rewrite of Act Two now includes a show-stopping ending.
Seems to me to be one of his most perfect acts. The marching band is heard in a different key coming from offstage. It stops the music in the orchestra. And we get the feeling, as we would in life, that something is coming our way from a distance and is in a completely different mood and in a completely different atmosphere than what we have just been experiencing.
Although the critics struggled with La Bohème, audiences loved it, and productions sprang up in London, Buenos Aires, New York, Moscow, Paris, and Berlin. Like he did with all of his operas, Puccini traveled the world to keep a close eye on each new opening, trimming and rewriting as he went.
I don't know any other composer who is this perfectionistic to this extent, and it's this intense observation of the audience's response that enables these pieces finally to be put into a form that feels inevitable.
Puccini's success was driven not only by what theatergoers liked, but also by what a growing home audience was listening to. A brand new technology just hit the market, and Puccini's popular tunes were the perfect match for it.
The advent of the phonograph was a very big thing, and it happened to coincide very conveniently with Puccini's career.
The phonograph record at this time was the 78, which fit about 4 minutes and 30 seconds on a side. And all of his arias are that length or shorter. The arias were disseminated throughout the world amazingly quickly. And this is something that no composer had had until this very moment.
Puccini benefited tremendously from that, probably benefited more than anything else from one guy, and that was Enrico Caruso, the great tenor.
Enrico Caruso's big break into opera occurred when he tried out for La Bohème. The audition was with Puccini, who was so impressed that he asked Caruso, "Who sent you to me, God himself?" Caruso's incredible voice and Puccini's popular music were a winning combination, and together they quickly gained international notoriety. With money rolling in from La Bohème's worldwide success, Puccini purchased a lakeside Italian villa where he could compose in peace and enjoy his favorite pastime, hunting. He once said, "After the piano, my favorite instrument is the rifle." At the villa, Puccini was famous for sitting at the upright piano and composing while the room was full of guests playing cards. But Puccini wrote slowly, often taking 3 or 4 years to compose each opera. His wife, Elvira, would complain that Verdi had completed 3 operas in the time that it was taking him to write just 1. But that wasn't her only complaint. Puccini was a notorious playboy, and Elvira was insanely jealous of his relationships with other women.
There was one incident where Elvira Puccini became very, very jealous, thought that Puccini was flirting with a maid in the Puccini household, maybe having an affair with her, and this drove the maid to such despair that she actually committed suicide. So this was a big scandal.
Life at the Puccini villa seemed to the neighbors to resemble a scene from one of the composer's own operas. Act 3 of La Bohème is set outside a tavern. It is winter, a cold, bleak landscape, quite different from the festive cafe scene in the previous act. While the music here sounds dramatically different from Act 2, it is in fact created from the very same notes.
When we arrive at Café Momus in Act 2, we hear this tremendous bustle in the orchestra. Which is then, in Act 3, transformed into they are simply as cold as they can possibly be. Certainly they feel like falling snow, but they also are the opposite side of the happiness of the opening of Act 2.
Mimi, growing more ill from tuberculosis, arrives to overhear Rodolfo tell his friends that her condition is terminal. She is going to die.
In her bones, she's known she's ill. To hear someone articulate it like he does, that brings it home, and suddenly, you know, the whole specter of death is right in front of her.
Musically, Puccini does not take the easy way out. As the melancholy duo embrace, another couple argues nearby. The foolish spat is interwoven with Mimi and Rodolfo's tender song. The quartet reveals what is meaningful in life by showing us what is not.
Puccini is full of these moments, this juxtaposition of the tragic and the everyday and the funny and everything together. Puccini is like life. There's no separation between all different kinds of events. And I think that really speaks to people.
After La Bohème, Puccini would go on to write 8 more operas, each portraying ordinary people during extraordinary times in their lives. Tosca is the story of a heroine who tries in vain to save the life of her lover, a revolutionary in prison, by killing the chief of police. Puccini even wrote an opera set in California's gold rush.
2 of Puccini's operas premiered right here in New York City, and one of them was La Fanciulla del West, the Girl of the Golden West, sort of a spaghetti western, if you will.
His last opera, Turandot, is set in China and remained unfinished at the time of his death.
If you were to hear 5 bars of any of the Puccini operas, whether it's a piece that you know or don't know, there's no question that it is Puccini. He never loses the Puccinian fingerprint. He is always Puccini.
But it was the Puccini style that may have led to the near failure of another masterpiece. Madame Butterfly is the tragic story of a Japanese geisha, Cho-Cho-san, who falls in love with an American sailor. The two are married, but he then leaves for America. She waits 3 years for him to return and meanwhile gives birth to their son. Her husband returns, but with a new American wife. Cho-Cho-san is so distraught that she commits suicide in the final scene. While Madame Butterfly has endured now for more than a century, The opening night performance was the biggest disaster of Puccini's career. Audiences complained that Butterfly sounded too much like Puccini's other operas, including La Bohème.
It was not received well by the public or the critics. There were boos and catcalls, and it absolutely traumatized Puccini because Puccini was not an ivory tower kind of guy. He was really interested in the public loving what he did.
After the catastrophic opening night, he immediately pulled the opera, paying off the theater owners, and set about reworking it. 2 years later, Madame Butterfly opened again, to great and lasting acclaim. Puccini always strove to deliver honest emotions by not shying away from a musical challenge. In the last act of La Bohème, he needed to depict the death of Mimi in a way that felt real.
Mimi's statement to Rodolfo after everyone has left in Act 4 is based on a descending scale. And it's this sinking of the melody that depicts so strongly and so clearly Mimi's approaching death. And so you hear, and of course, the tune does go up there, but here's the next note. And here's the next one.
Then we get back to this soft key, you know, qui amor, here love, you know. And again, she's losing her voice, she's losing her energy. Now she's even losing it more. She can get one word out. Has to take time to recover it. That chord comes in, and that's the death chord. Her death is one of the great written things, I think. It's a wonderful moment.
No matter what the performance has been like, whether it's been good or whether it's been bad, it doesn't matter. The audience is always dissolved in tears at the end of Bohème.
After Puccini wrote that scene, he had to put down his pen and he started to weep uncontrollably. He said, "I felt as though I had seen the death of my own child." So, you know, there's a kind of real sorcery at work to which not even he was immune.
At the age of 65, Puccini fell ill with throat cancer, and a year later, in 1924, he died.
One of the great tragedies, really, of opera is the fact that Puccini died before completing Turandot.
Turandot was finished by another composer, and when it was first performed 2 years after Puccini's death, his longtime friend Arturo Toscanini conducted the performance. He led the orchestra as far as Puccini had written, then stopped the performance in the middle of the last act and laid down his baton. He turned to the audience and said, "Here ends the opera, because at this point, the maestro died." In the end, Giacomo Puccini did what he set out to do. He elevated the intimate details of ordinary life onto the grand stage and left behind an operatic legacy that no one before or since has ever matched.